we'll start with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning everybody. Okay, today we will be taking for study Sutta number 38 in the Middle Length Discourses. This is called the Greater Discourse on the Destruction of Craving, Mahatanhasankhaya Sutta. This is one of the most important of the Buddha's discourses for understanding paticca samuppada, one of the key teachings of the Buddha. Sometimes it's presented as the essential discovery of the Buddha at the time of his enlightenment. And this discourse also has some important things to teach about the nature of consciousness. Okay, the sutta begins, we're on page 349. The sutta begins when a certain monk whose name is Sati gives rise to what is called a pernicious view, or a wrong view. And his view is that, he says, as I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One, by the Buddha, it is this same consciousness that runs and wanders through the round of rebirths, that is through samsara, not another. So the exact words that he uses here are very important. What he's saying is that it is the same consciousness that wanders through the round of rebirths. And so basically his view is that consciousness is one single entity that always remains the same, and this entity called consciousness, remaining the same, moves from life to life through the round of rebirths. And so his view is very similar to the view of Brahmanism, or what's later called Hinduism, the view that there is some kind of entity called the Self, the Atman, that remains the same and moves from life to life. There is an important Hindu work called Bhagavad Gita, which uses the simile of a man who might have several suits of clothes. And so this person, one part of the day, will put on one suit of clothes, then take off those clothes, put on another suit of clothes, change those clothes, put on another suit of clothes. So the person remains the same, but it's just the clothes that are different. And so according to the Bhagavad Gita, it is the Atman, or the Self, that always remains the same, but it is just the bodies that the Self puts on that are different. So the Self takes up one body, wears it for the whole course of a lifetime. When that body dies, the Self gives up the body, takes on another body, and in this way it always remains the same, just changing its bodies. And so the view of Sati is very similar to this. Okay, so now Sati is probably going around telling others about his understanding of the Dharma. And then a number of the other monks hear about this. And first they ask Sati, is it true that this is your view? And so Sati says, that is the case, friends. As I understand the Buddha's Dharma, it is the same consciousness that runs and wanders through the round of rebirths, not another. Okay, the monks, those monks who understand the Buddha's teaching correctly, by questioning him and cross-questioning him, they try to get him to give up that view. And so they say, friend Sati, do not say this, do not misrepresent the Blessed One, the Buddha. It's not good to misrepresent the Blessed One. The Blessed One would not speak thus, for in many ways the Blessed One has stated that consciousness is dependently arisen, since without a condition there is no arising of consciousness. So the monks are saying that it can't be the case that it is the same consciousness that wanders unchanged from life to life, because consciousness always arises through conditions. We'll see the full implications of this a little bit later. But now the monks persistently try to persuade Sati to give up that view, but instead of giving up the view, he just goes on adhering to it. The text says he obstinately adhered to that pernicious view and continued to insist upon it. So this is very much like ourselves. Sometimes we get into an argument and somebody tries to persuade us to give up our opinion. And even though the person might have good arguments against us, but do we give up our view very easily? What do? Sandy? You obstinately adhere to it and insist on it, right? What? Sometimes you insist. Okay, so what happens after the monks try again and again to convince him to give up the view, at a certain point they find that their efforts are futile, and so the only thing they have left to do is to go to the Buddha and report the matter to the Buddha. And so the Buddha, when he hears about this, he doesn't just immediately start to blame Sati, but first he calls Sati to his presence. So Sati goes to the Buddha, and then the Buddha again doesn't start immediately criticizing Sati, but this is a kind of fixed procedure that the Buddha always uses, that when somebody accuses somebody else of doing something wrong, the Buddha first calls the alleged offender to his presence, and then he asks him, is it true that this is what you are doing? So before the Buddha will criticize a person, he wants to get the person himself to admit what he's doing. Okay, so now I'm in paragraph 5 on page 350. So Sati comes to the Buddha's presence, sits to one side, and the Buddha then asks him, Sati, is it true that the following view has arisen in you? As I understand the Dharma, it is the same consciousness that runs and wanders through the round of rebirths, not another. Okay, Sati admits this. Again, the Buddha doesn't immediately criticize him, but the Buddha wants him to clarify his understanding, because he might have understood it right, but just is getting the wording wrong. So the Buddha asks him, what is that consciousness, Sati? Then Sati says, it is that which speaks and feels and experiences here and there the result of good and bad actions. Okay, so here at this point, Sati is making it very clear, that very explicit, that his view of consciousness is virtually identical with the Brahminic view of the self. According to Sati, consciousness is what speaks, what acts, and also experiences the result of actions, of karma. So consciousness creates karma, and it is the same consciousness that experiences the results of karma. Okay, now, according to the Buddha's teaching, and this is an important point, consciousness is actually, we call this maybe the string or the thread that strings together the different lives that we live in samsara. Well, consciousness, we can express this a little differently. You could say that consciousness is the factor of continuity, the factor that maintains our personal identity through the course of one life and from one life to the next life. So it is consciousness that continues on from life to life. So the Buddha doesn't teach that consciousness comes to a complete end with the death of the body, but rather consciousness goes on evolving from life to life. But according to the Buddha's teaching, consciousness is not a single entity. Rather, what the Buddha teaches is that consciousness is a process, a continuum, a stream of events, or we could say it's a sequence of individual occasions of consciousness. So at one moment, consciousness arises, passes away, followed by a new occasion of consciousness which arises and passes away. And that is followed by another occasion of consciousness, another, throughout the whole course of life. So what our life is, or at least the mental side of the life, is a series, a sequence, a continuum of occasions of experience, occasions of consciousness arising together with a number of other mental factors, feeling, perception, volitions, and many other mental factors. And in a single life, this sequence or stream of consciousness occurs based upon the same physical body. And so we speak of ourselves as being the same person that woke up this morning, that went to bed last night, that did certain activities yesterday, the same person that was at one time 20 years old, 15 years old, 10 years old, born in such and such a year. We say we're the same person, even though consciousness is always changing. But because the consciousness is arising based upon what seems to be the same body, we say we are the same person. Now, what happens when death takes place is that the body, the life force in the body, is cut off or extinguished. And so the body can no longer support the process of consciousness. But consciousness itself doesn't come to an end. Rather, as long as there are the ignorance and craving and clinging within consciousness, when the body passes away, then consciousness flows on or moves on to a new existence. Again, it flows on not as a single entity remaining ever the same, but rather it flows on like a river, streaming on, ever-changing, and then driven by the karmic tendencies, the consciousness will latch on to another physical organism, a physical form which has just come into being, and in this way it starts the process of rebirth. And so when consciousness connects to an ovum, a fertilized egg, then in the case of a human rebirth, then a new human life begins. And then again, consciousness will flow on, always changing from moment to moment through the whole course of a life. So again, this is like the image of, or to use a simile, it's like the rivers in the water. The rivers in the water, no, I'm sorry. The waters in the river, like you see the Hudson River. Who has to come here had to pass the Hudson River or ride alongside the Hudson River. And earlier times you came here, you saw the Hudson River, right? So we say conventionally the Hudson River is the same. We don't say the Hudson River gets up and moves away. But the water in the Hudson River, always changing. We don't know the water in the Hudson River last week, now it could be Atlantic Ocean. Then it vaporizes, it can be the clouds overhead in the sky. And it starts to rain, it can be the rain coming down on us. So this is all the river, the water from the Hudson River, but the forms change. And even though there's new water in the Hudson River, but we still say it's the same Hudson River. And so with consciousness, it's the same. So one occasion of consciousness is responsible for action, another occasion of consciousness becomes active, or another occasion of consciousness occurs when we're speaking, and still different occasions of consciousness occur when we experience the results of our action, the fruits of our karma. But conventionally, we say it's the same consciousness, but that is only a convenient term of expression. Just like the Hudson River, it's a convenient term of expression. Okay, so this is why the Buddha is rejecting the view of Sati when he says that which speaks and feels and experiences here and there, that is in one life or another life, the result of good and bad actions, good and bad karma. That is what I mean by consciousness. Okay, now the Buddha starts to reproach or reprimand Sati. And he's, as Andrea pointed out last week, sometimes the Buddha can be pretty tough, you know. We shouldn't have an image of the Buddha as being this always the nice, smiling guy who says, whatever you do, it's okay with me. But he can really be a little bit frightful, you know. If somebody says to me, the Buddha is over in the big Buddha hall, would you like to go to meet him? Then I think about all of my faults, all the bad things I've done. Then I think, yeah, why don't you make an appointment for me for next week? You know, I think if I walk into that room, the Buddha's going to be looking at me, you know, like, I can read your mind, kid. Okay, so the Buddha says to him, misguided man, to whom have you ever known me to teach the Dhamma in that way? Misguided man? Please, Bhante. The first time you said it, I got the point. Have I not stated in many ways consciousness to be dependently arisen, since without a condition there is no origination of consciousness? But you, misguided man, have misrepresented us, that's me, by your wrong grasp, and you've injured yourself and stored up much demerit, for this will lead to your harm and suffering for a long time. Okay, then the Buddha turns to the other monks and he says, what do you think? Has this monk Sati kindled even a spark of wisdom in this Dharma and discipline? Again, this is a little bit like sort of rubbing it in. And so the other monks say, how could that be, Venerable Sir? No, Venerable Sir. Okay, then Sati now feels somewhat humiliated, dismayed. He's sitting there, unable to respond. And now the Buddha is going to point out how the Dhamma should be understood correctly. So he turns to the other monks and he says, do you understand the Dharma that I've been teaching in the same way that Sati does? And the Buddha says, the other monks say, no, Bhante, for in many discourses the Blessed One has stated consciousness to be dependently arisen. Okay, then the Buddha repeats the same point, but now I want we get into the real heart of the sutta. Now the Buddha is going to show how consciousness is dependently arisen. And the word that's used here for dependently arisen is paticca samuppanna. This is the past participle form based on the noun paticca samuppada. Okay, so consciousness is said to be dependently arisen or dependently originated. And that is because consciousness always arises based upon particular conditions. And usually the texts speak about two primary conditions for the arising of consciousness. These two primary conditions are called in Pali ayatana, which means base or basis. And there are two kinds of bases, the internal base and the external base. Okay, so I said each type of consciousness arises based upon two types of basis. And so this is what the Buddha is pointing out in paragraph 8 of the sutta. He says, when consciousness arises dependent on the I and forms, it is reckoned as I consciousness. When consciousness arises dependent on the ear and sounds, it is reckoned as ear consciousness. When consciousness arises dependent on the nose and odors, it is reckoned as nose consciousness. When consciousness arises dependent on the tongue and flavors, it is reckoned as tongue consciousness. When consciousness arises dependent on the body and tangibles or tactile sensations, it is reckoned as body consciousness. So those are the 5 types of sense consciousness or sensory consciousness. And so the I is the base for visual consciousness. So a type of consciousness arises based on the I, and that type of consciousness sees visible forms. What it does, that type of consciousness, is to open up the whole field of awareness through the I so that we can perceive or cognize visible forms through the I. And similarly, with the ear consciousness arises based on the ear, and it opens up the whole field of sounds to cognition by ear consciousness. And so for the other 3 types of sense consciousness. Each type of consciousness arises exclusively based on its own sense faculty, and each of these 5 types of sense consciousness has only one kind of object. Eye consciousness doesn't hear sounds. Eye consciousness doesn't taste flavors. Like maybe you look at a meal put out before you, and by looking at it, you think you can taste the flavor of, ice cream or cake, whatever. But that's just imagination. But what you're actually doing is seeing colored forms with the eye. Okay, and that's the same with each of the other types of sensory consciousness. Each is sort of uniquely attuned. Each type of consciousness arises exclusively through its own sense base, its own faculty, and each is uniquely attuned to its own type of object. But then we come to the 6th type of consciousness, which is somewhat more complex. This is what is called in Pali manoviññāna, which we translate as mind consciousness. This is the consciousness that arises through what is called the mind base, or mental faculty. And this type of consciousness operates in 2, actually even perhaps 3, at least 3 ways. One way is to identify the objects perceived through through the sensory consciousnesses. For example, this cup is in front of me. So what does eye consciousness do? Eye consciousness only brings in colored, shaped form. Eye consciousness doesn't know what this is. Eye consciousness, very stupid, but very precise and very, well, it used to be when I was younger. But generally it's very precise, very accurate, like a camera. takes in exactly the form. You take a picture of a scene, and unless if you don't manipulate the film in any way, the camera takes in exactly what's in front of you. And so the eye consciousness takes in the form, but the eye consciousness has no idea what this is, what it's used for. But it's the mind consciousness arising through the eye. This time the mind consciousness actually occurs with two faculties. Based on occurring in the eye, through the eye, the mind consciousness is able to sort of put this form together and identify it as a cup, and then it sees in the cup clear liquid, which it identifies as water. Okay, so the mind consciousness identifies what is seen by eye consciousness. What is that? Did the ear consciousness know that?
Yeah, but my mind did.
So, if you didn't have ear consciousness, would you have been able to say Beethoven's Fifth? What?
Yeah, of course not.
You have to say, certainly not, but...
No, never will say.
If all the senses are allotted consciousness, what are perceptions?
That's mind action.
Okay, let's put that question aside for a moment. Just get into first let's deal with the different types of consciousness. Okay, so ear consciousness has the function of picking up the sounds. Like all I said was boop, 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 boop. Four notes. And yet, because the ear consciousness picked that up very accurately, you could identify it through the mind consciousness, Beethoven's Fifth. Similarly, if somebody is cooking, you go into the kitchen, what's for lunch? You smell, and then you know what's for lunch. You identify based on the smell consciousness. But what identifies is mind consciousness. Somebody gives you something to eat. If you're blindfolded, identify it. Just based on the tongue consciousness, you can identify what that is. Similarly with tactile sensations. Okay, so one function of the mind consciousness is to identify things seen, heard, and so on through each of the individual types of sense consciousness. Another function, a second function of the mind consciousness is to synthesize sense data coming from the other types of sense consciousness in order to form a composite picture of an object. Even the word picture, in a way, biases the idea towards visual object. Let's say to form a concept of the object. And so I say in front of me, let us say, a round, oval object with a reddish surface, little specks of green, a stem coming out of the top, and let us say I get a certain scent from it. Suppose it's been cut up into pieces, a certain scent comes. And then I associate the form, the scent, with certain memories, and then that comes to the idea of, I come up with the idea of apple, pieces of apple. So here, mind consciousness is putting together a number of sensory objects to get a picture. And so actually, any individual sense, when mind consciousness works through any of the senses, it's usually not just working in complete isolation, but it's bringing together a number of sensory perceptions and then connecting them with a memory in order to come up with an idea. Okay, the third function of the mind consciousness is to deal with a class of objects of its own. These objects are what I call, the Pali uses simply the word dhammas. We might translate this as mental phenomena. So these are things that appear exclusively to the mind, not based on the senses. So we can have ideas, abstract ideas, general ideas. We can perform, say, mathematical operations. We make inferences, inductions. We do use logical reasoning. We have memory images. We have imaginary ideas. So a whole complex mass of objects that are purely mental, not coming in directly through any of the senses. And so these are all called dhammas, mental phenomena, and those are the objects of mind consciousness. And the mind consciousness is said to arise dependent on the mind. There's actually a lot of disputes among the Buddhist scholars. What is meant by mind independence upon which mind consciousness arises? It's not a physical organ, but it is considered to be like a subtle, the general opinion that this is the subconscious flow of consciousness. Then, based upon that, the mind consciousness arises, the active mind consciousness. And it takes the purely mental objects as its objects, special objects. Okay, so those are the 6 classes of consciousness. Then Richard raised the question just a few minutes ago, where does perception fit into the picture? Well, we have to remember that according to Buddhism, consciousness doesn't arise alone, but it always arises together with a whole crowd, a whole group of other mental factors, each with its own special function. And so the way I understand it is that consciousness is that mental factor that opens up a particular field of awareness, and then perception is the mental function that arises together with consciousness and then selects certain factors or certain qualities of the object as a basis for identification. So, when I see, say, this pair of glasses, then it would be eye consciousness that brings in the form. It will be mind consciousness that sort of generally identifies these as glasses, but it is perception that has selected certain features of this object, that has selected particular type of frame, particular type of, what do you call these?
Aren't they called bows? Or the earpieces?
Earpieces. Flows?
Bows.
Bows.
B-O-W-S, I think.
Oh. Okay, the bows or handles, and this is All these things that I use, I don't even know the names of them.
Retainer.
This is a retainer.
That's what it's called.
Really? You see, I'm building up a really rich store of mind consciousness or of perception. Just trying to find the names of all the little things that we use in everyday life that we don't even know the name of. Okay, so it's perception that selects these features, and so selecting those features, when I see these glasses someplace else, maybe on my lunch table or in the desk in my room, then I can identify this as being my glasses. So it's perception that selects particular features to identify things, and that serves as a basis for recognition. But we shouldn't, it's a kind of mistake to try to separate consciousness and perception, to put a very sharp wedge between them, thinking that perception does this and consciousness does that, because they work very, very closely in very, very close association. Maybe it's like two dance partners dancing a waltz on the dance floor, and they're dancing together, so you ask, who is putting out the right foot first? You know, each one is putting out the right foot together, and then when they turn, who's turning? They're turning together. Who's putting out the left foot? They're putting out the left foot together. So, because the two are dancing together, we say that they're dancing the waltz. But we shouldn't think because they're dancing together, therefore the two are one. They're two different people dancing, but if they're really good, from a really good dance team, they're dancing in such close coordination that we can't really distinguish who is doing what. They're just doing everything together in perfect harmony. So this is the way perception and consciousness work together. Okay, then to illustrate the way consciousness works, the Buddha uses the simile of a fire. Okay, just as fire is reckoned by the particular condition dependent on which it burns. There must have been very precise ways of speaking about fires in India. Nowadays we just speak about the fire. But it seems in India they had different expressions for different types of fire. Are you, Taru? You a Hindi speaker? Do they have different expressions in Hindi for different types of fire?
Yeah, the fire that is in the kitchen has a different name than the fire that's in the, what did they say? No practice
Maybe, do we have that? Please speak into the microphone. Yeah, okay, now it's working.
Yes. Yeah, they do have different names for the fire that's in the land versus the fire that's in the kitchen versus the fire that's used for doing what they call it yajnas in Hindi. You know, the fire that they burn when they are performing rituals.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a different name for
Yeah, okay. Okay, so it seems in the Buddha's time they had very precise names for different types of fires. So when a fire burns dependent on logs, then it's called a log fire. When the fire burns dependent on faggots, it's called a faggot fire. When the fire burns dependent on grass, it's reckoned as a grass fire. When it burns dependent on cow dung, it's reckoned as a cow dung fire. When it burns dependent on chaff, that's the discarded sort of hulls from rice and other grains, it's reckoned as a chaff fire. When fire burns dependent on rubbish, it's called a rubbish fire. And so consciousness is reckoned by the particular condition dependent on which it arises. Then he repeats the same thing. Okay, now this might give rise to interesting question. So that you might try to overturn the Buddha's position here and say, okay, fire depends on its condition. When the body passes away, then what does consciousness depend on? How can consciousness continue from life to life? There shouldn't be anything left for it to continue on. And so consciousness should be extinguished at death. So what does consciousness depend on? Yeah, Andrea.
It's just something which I'm reading about in this Majjhima Nikāya, where you go into the Mahatanhasankhaya, and it really gets into the various aggregates very deeply, as you know. And he just goes over and over again, you can't have consciousness without a body. You know, nama-rupa.
Yeah.
Can't have it. This is impossible. You can say that you don't have all the other things, but it is impossible because that you should say, yes, aside from everything else, there's consciousness. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
So that's a condition. And it's interesting, this fire, it really hit me, that really takes the self out of it. When you look at it that way, as this type of fire, that type of fire, another type of fire.
Yeah.
It takes
It
the
would be good if you could use the...
consciousness. I guess I'm not making any sense.
Voice arises dependent upon the speaker and the microphone and the speaker, yeah.
What do I have to say again? The whole thing I just said?
Just the last few sentences.
I can't remember now. When you were always talking about the...
Yeah, I
some of the fires, okay.
Right, yeah.
The way he talks about it, because especially in the Western world, and especially with English as a language, or even like the Romance languages, fire is fire is fire. It's not that big a deal. But when it's broken up, there's this kind of fire, that kind of fire, the other kind of fire, as he likens it to consciousness. That takes the self that we out of consciousness, that we normally ascribe to it, which you're not going to get if you're an English speaker using those kinds of concepts of fire.
Yeah.
That's all. I'm just noting that.
Okay, that's a good point. Does somebody have some idea about...
Well, at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned craving as one of the pathways.
Yeah.
At the beginning you mentioned after death, craving is one of the aspects that
Yeah.
perpetuates the continuity of consciousness.
Yeah.
And at the end of this, I do have a question about how those who... I'll ask you at the end of it, but craving was one of the points you brought up at the beginning. To your point about fire names, in our English language, we do have different... We bifurcate and split down other types of nouns. So we have an ability to reference, like the Inuit have multiple words for rain because of the waves of rain. So we have that in English, just perhaps not for fire. We have, as you can see in the holiday selection of Hallmark cards, different forms of love and well-wishing, so we can understand multi-nouns. But anyway, I'm only responding mechanically at the beginning of the talk.
Yeah.
This is a curious point for me, the maintenance of continuity of consciousness via craving.
Yeah. Yeah, we have many, many different flavors of ice cream. Whereas maybe in other countries you have chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry.
Yeah, it's 70%
You were going to say something more?
Yes, it's on. The only thing which I think is difficult is when it's really hard to talk about this stuff.
Yeah.
Because the Buddha teaches it in a negative way. When anybody tries to ask him what it is, he just says what it's not. So I just want to make the point, you tell me if I'm wrong, but when you speak about continuity of consciousness, you're kind of talking around the concept of self, even if you don't mean to, because we tend to attach to self. It's just a point I'm making. It's very difficult to talk about in a positivist mode. There's some danger in it.
Yeah. What I would
and language is limited. So.
Okay, what I would say is that self, to refer to one's personal, let's say personal continuity, even from life to life, can be used legitimately as a conventional designation.
Right.
Or even to indicate, to refer to the continuity of the individual person. So I would say that the empirical self is a reality as the person, but the person is a conditioned phenomena. And so the word self that's usually sort of persistently rejected by Buddhism is the idea of self as a solid, substantial, continuous entity, an entity that preserves its own identity through a changing process. So that is what is being rejected. Okay, but I don't want to get into the self issue now. We're talking about what can serve as the basis for consciousness in making the transition from life to life.
One thing that occurs to me is that there can be a tendency for fire, like in California or in Florida, when conditions are very, very dry. They anticipate fire. And in the same way, with consciousness, when the body dies, there can be a karmic tendency towards more fire. Just like, because this is widely done, and it's very impersonal. They just know when the conditions are very, very dry, and the weather gets hot, and there are lightning storms, there will be fire.
Actually, that's a very interesting point.
Spontaneous combustion.
So conditions have created the likelihood that fire will continue.
So there's actually a possibility. Now, when I raise that question, what provides a basis for continuity of consciousness, one doesn't find a clear answer in the suttas. And so what you just brought up is a third possibility compared to the two that I had in mind, which is an interesting one, that consciousness goes into a state, call it abeyance or suspension or like almost a hibernation.
Looking for conditions.
So it's not actually looking because it's not sort of active, but just it's there as a potential. And when the conditions, the right karmic conditions appear, then the consciousness will arise. That's a possibility I didn't think of. But let me first go through the two positions that have emerged within the Buddhist tradition. Okay, one position, this is the sort of orthodox Theravada position, sort of defended by the commentaries based on the Abhidharma. And this is, and several other Buddhist schools also accepted this position, that there is no actual break from one life to the next, but that rebirth takes place instantaneously after death. So one moment there's a death consciousness, person dies. The next moment, the rebirth consciousness springs up. And then the life process starts again. And so there's no time, no occasion when consciousness is not in some kind of embodied form, arising and functioning actively. Okay, let me go through both positions first before I take other comments. The other position which was accepted by some of the other early Buddha schools, and then sort of developed in Tibetan Buddhism. And this is the idea that there is a period or phase between two existences when consciousness is not yet fully embodied, fully incarnated into a sentient being, but the consciousness is continuing in some kind of, the Pali and Sanskrit uses the expression antarabhava. Antarabhava. Yes, antarabhava. Intermediate state. No, it's antarabhava. Sorry. No, I now remember the word. Sorry. Antarabhava. Okay, now in argument against this position, somebody can quote the sutta that Andrea referred to just a few minutes ago, the sutta that says that anyone should teach or proclaim the passing away and rebirth of consciousness apart from form, apart from feeling, apart from perception, apart from volitions. That, I say, is impossible. We have several suttas like that. So this is what a defender of the intermediate existence can say, that in the intermediate state, consciousness exists, but it doesn't exist alone. It exists together with a subtle body. This would be something like the astral body of the Theosophist. A kind of it's a material body, but very, very subtle, so that we can't see it with our eyes or touch it with our hands. So it's associated with a very subtle material body, and it has feeling, perception, and volitions. So the other aggregates are there, but they're all in this very subtle condition, which is the intermediate state. And so the consciousness in this condition moves around until the appropriate conditions appear on the earth, and then it will take rebirth into a mother's womb. So that's the possibility. So actually we have three possibilities here. You can found Tracy, you could found a new school of Buddhism, basically. You'll have adherents of the Orthodox Theravada arguing against you, the adherents of Tibetan Buddhism arguing against you, and then you can defend yourself with counter-arguments and similes. Okay, so the three positions: immediate rebirth, right after death, instantaneously. Second position, intermediate state, in which there's a very subtle personality made of the five aggregates, sort of moving around until conditions appear for rebirth to occur. And then the third position, we call it the Tracy Vada, is that consciousness sort of goes into a state of suspension or temporary cessation until the conditions appear, the right karmic conditions, and then it arises again. Okay, you wrong?
subset of the second position you mentioned, because if there is a latent tendency, it has to exist somewhere. It doesn't exist nowhere, so it has to be based on something. And so it's either the subtle state or the antarabhava. It has to be somewhere.
There's no it. You're still thinking of self to exist or not exist. That's the crux of all this.
Because you're replacing it with a tendency. So where does that tendency lie? Where does it lie?
When conditions are right, it arises. It's like the fire analogy.
Yeah.
The fire blows out. Where do you say it goes? That's like the famous fluid traces.
Yeah, but then you're talking about consciousness.
No, I still see a difference between the two positions. In what we call the Sarvastivada position, or let's call it the intermediate state existence, the consciousness is still there, it's still functioning. Maybe from our human point of view, it's gone into suspension or hibernation. But from its own perspective, this being who has passed away the being who has passed away is sort of moving around in this astral plane. The being is conscious, aware of things that are going on earth. It's just that from our point of view, we can't see that being, we can't touch it, can't communicate with it.
But isn't that similar to the Brahmanic idea of Brahma? That there is this great self, the individual derived from that self, and then we return to it when the body disappears.
No, not at all. Because it's remaining an individual stream of consciousness, just the way we're individual streams of consciousness.
How is it preserved as an entity?
It's preserved through, it's connected to a body, there's a physical body there.
Here goes the subset of the second position. It has to exist somewhere.
Yeah, it exists.
Identify it as a human.
Well, it doesn't have to exist on the same, let's say, the same vibrational frequency that we exist on.
Yeah, so it's Brahma.
No, it doesn't have to go up to Brahma.
The mind is back.
Yeah, it can be floating around in a way here. Let me give you some concrete examples of this. These are based on cases. I mean, I don't remember specific examples, but there's a book by Francis Story, he was one of the investigators of rebirth cases, and he used to work together with the professor from University of Virginia, Ian Stevenson, and they investigated rebirth cases together, children or young people who report remembering their earlier life. And what some of the people interviewed say is that they remember their death in the previous life. And what they experience is always the same, occurs in the same way, that they will experience themselves, conscious, first on the deathbed, lying there dying. Then what happens at a certain point, they find the consciousness or their sense of identity floating up to the ceiling, and they're looking down at their body on the deathbed, and they might see their relatives come into the room, maybe call a doctor. They'll see the doctor come in, check the body, then say something to the relatives start weeping, and there they are. They see themselves having the same body, and they're up against the ceiling, looking down and trying to communicate, trying to say, I'm still here, but nobody is responding to them. The relatives are still weeping, and then maybe the next day they'll see their body spread out on they call it the bier, is that what it's called? Bier. And they'll see all of the relatives gathering in the room, and they might be trying to communicate. In one case that I read, the dog was barking up at them, and the people were trying to quiet the dog. Somehow the dog sensed the person, but the other relatives couldn't sense the person. And then they'll see them carrying the body out to the cremation ground or the cemetery, burning the body, and then when the body is gone and everything is ended, then they find themselves just moving about, looking at things going on in this world. They can move over great distances just in what seems to be a split second. They don't have a clear idea of how much time is passing until they find a certain couple to whom they're attracted. Then they hang around that couple for some time until the magic moment takes place. Then they feel themselves being drawn into the woman's body, and they've lost awareness of what has taken place after that until they come out again as a human being.
In light of that description and
Okay,
that implies that your consciousness, eye consciousness, even feeling consciousness, exists without ear, without eye.
No.
Because the body is now defunct.
Yeah, the human body is defunct, but they do have the subtle body. It's not a disembodied consciousness. It's existing. They look down. They see themselves in the same body. And so they have a kind of eye which is able to function. At least, okay, I haven't done any vivisection or dissection under any of their bodies. So I can't speak about how their optic nerve is functioning, what parts of the brain are being activated.
What is the, I don't know if this is the appropriate time to ask then, by what way, if there are ways by which a normal or a non-elevated being, for lack of a better word, arhat, what word actually means, other than it's a pretty elevated person in consciousness terms, maybe avoiding firm sense of self. I'm using conventional speech in here. What are the evidence? What is the way by which such a being that wishes to return and save all sentient beings? What is the pathway by which, after death, that being routes itself back into sentient being? How is that described? Because that might help you flesh out the picture.
Okay, this isn't described in the early suttas, but this is the way the Bodhisattva ideal came to be developed in Mahayana Buddhism. Okay, in this account, somebody who aspires to follow the Bodhisattva path makes a vow, or sometimes several vows, which sort of become one of the bases of their spiritual life. And then as they go on cultivating that vow, it gets stronger and stronger. And so maybe not in this life itself, but as they go on, let us say the vow will tend to connect them to situations where they can continue to practice the Dhamma. And the vow will tend to be reactivated life after life by meeting with the appropriate conditions. Okay, if they go on cultivating and strengthening that vow and developing all their other spiritual faculties, they can reach a point where, if they wanted, they can achieve liberation. But because of the force of that vow to follow the Bodhisattva path, they're able to come back again and again. Whether they can actually determine the conditions of their own rebirth, or whether it's just that the vow will bring them to favorable conditions. This is something I don't know the clear answer to.
Is that vow also volition?
The vow, of course, is an expression of volition, yeah. Okay, Taro?
So one thing, how do we reconcile? I think this is where a little bit of confusion comes in when somebody is going through Buddhist teachings. So on one side we say that there is this stream of consciousness that goes through the process of rebirth.
Yeah.
And On the other hand, we say there is no body, there is no fixed entity that is taking rebirth.
Yeah.
So how do we reconcile these two things?
Well, the way they're reconciled is through the principle that there's no fixed entity that's going from life to life, but there is the stream of consciousness, there is the stream of experience. And so that stream of experience is what forms the basis for a personal identity, and it enables us to identify ourselves with other beings who have lived in the past, who are, we could say, our karmic ancestors, those who have been the home to the stream of consciousness that's presently flowing through us.
So does it mean that the stream of consciousness is not fixed in the sense, for example, if we can take 3 separate sticks and burn and the fire can be created out of that.
Yeah.
Now the fire was made out of 3 separate sticks, let's say.
Yeah.
So is it possible that human beings are similar to that, and that what I am in this birth, I might not be a result of just me in the last birth, but maybe I'm a combination of 2 or 3 different streams of consciousness?
No, I understand it to be that you are the continuation of one stream of consciousness. Of course, you're influenced by other people in the past as well as in the present, but there's only, I think there's only one stream of consciousness flowing through you.
So this is where I really get stuck. So I cannot see the difference between the stream of consciousness and what the Hindus call the Atma, the soul.
Yeah.
What is the real difference?
The difference is
Why don't you take the microphone? Give him the microphone.
the difference is you need the cause conditions go through you. If there's flesh, and you cling to that consciousness based on the past karma, based on your the gravitational pull that you're attracted to. But if you're consciously aware of this is just a phenomenon. The Atma, the self, doesn't really exist.
Okay, maybe let me try to put this in the way I would understand it. Okay, according to the Buddhist, sort of the Buddhist point of view, like any idea of the self as being a fixed, substantial entity that is our true identity is an expression of clinging. So the most fundamental type of clinging, according to the Buddha, is the clinging to the view of self, the idea of self. So what we have is this stream of consciousness running through us, always changing. And normally when we are seeking the self, the thing that we cling to most as being ourself is the consciousness. And that clinging arises because we haven't been able to examine the consciousness with insight to see how consciousness is always arising and passing away. But when one sees the arising and passing away of the consciousness, then the clinging to the consciousness falls away. And when the clinging falls away, then the identification of consciousness as being a real self falls away. Okay, I think we'll have to break now for the lunch. Then, if you want to continue, we could continue the discussion after lunch at 12 o'clock, or a little after 12 o'clock, 12:10, let's say. Okay, so we will do the sharing of the merits. I think they will be handing out the sheets. Okay, then I'll be having the class next week. Next week is September 25th. And please bring the handout that we gave out this week. I didn't get to it today. If you have the book, you just fold it and put it in the book or in your notebook. Then you'll be sure to bring it next week. Okay, so let us end by sharing the merits. Akasata chabhumata devanaga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam. Akasata chabhumata devanaga mahitika punyantang anumoditva Chirang rakantu desanam. Akasata chabhumata devanaga mahitika punyantang anumoditva Chirang rakantu mang parang. Etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang Sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang Sabbe satanumodantu Sabba sampati siddhya Bhavagupadaya vichihitato Vedantare satakaya upapanna Rupya rupicha sanya sanino Dukha pamuchantu Pusantu nibhuting. Okay, please stand. Okay, we do 3 bows to the Buddha.